This podcast contains content such as bullying and mental health topics and may not be suitable for listeners who are impacted by these topics. If you are experiencing issues in your workplace or would like more information on resources available in your location, please check the show notes or head to www.supercooltoxicworkplace.com.
Being a woman in beer, it's like you're already heavily criticized for abilities or knowledge. So I was like just trying to keep my mouth shut and soak up as much as I could.
They don't really know why they're saying that they weren't involved. Again, because I'm literally in contact with you every day.
I saw things at San Diego that were horrible. I did things about it. I tried to get a lot of support from Denmark, and I feel that they didn't take it very seriously. I know for a fact they both knew about the severity of these issues, cut and dry, in May, June of 2018 in San Diego.
This is Super Cool Toxic Workplace, Episode 3, San Diego. On this episode, we hear from journalist and contributor to Good Beer Hunting, Kate Bernot, revisiting how she came to report on Mikkeller and how the resulting response from Brienne Allen's Ratmagnet Instagram MeToo craft brewing reckoning led her to reporting out the first public, investigated claims from former employees of Mikkeller. These claims were centered around San Diego, so we hear the detailed stories of Megan Stoner and Teresa Pominville, two former employees featured in Kate Bernot's reporting. Then a source comes forward, verifying much of what we knew from these testimonies, but also providing details about what we did not. In 2015, Mikkeller finalized the acquisition of the premises that would eventually become Mikkeller Brewing San Diego. On April 6th, 2016, the company announces on their website, Mikkeller will double its yearly beer production when the brewery Mikkeller Brewing San Diego opens its doors with a mini beer festival on the 16th of April, 2016. Not only was the establishment of yet another international location notable, but it was also the company's first physical brewery. And as the company itself notes, this could be quite the game changer when it comes to production. In this episode, you'll hear from a total of 3 sources who have worked at Mikkeller San Diego. Some allegations about Mikkeller San Diego have been public since July 1st, 2021. And these allegations were initially reported by Kate Bernot, who we have already heard from briefly in this podcast. Kate Bernot, through the Sightlines section of Good Beer Hunting, has consistently been reporting on Mikkeller this past year. But that's not the only reporting Kate Bernot has done on the company, so I wanted to revisit that a little first before we got into the details of her San Diego reporting.
So I really have to go back in time to answer that question because I think I probably first wrote about the brewery when I was an editor at a print craft beer magazine called Ratmagnet, which doesn't exist anymore. But I was working there in the middle part of the 2010s and covered their beer from a purely consumer perspective. What does it taste like? Who is this brewery? In 2016, myself and the other editors named the Mikkeller and Lindemann Spot and Basil one of our favorite 25 beers of the year. So that was probably the first time I recall really covering them in a way that I can recall. And then as a freelance writer, I'd written about them in the years since then. I wrote a profile of their running club for the running magazine Runner's World, in which I talked to people from their running clubs all over the world about why it was so popular. So I've certainly had interactions with them over the years before I joined Good Beer Hunting.
Kate and I move on to discuss more contemporary topics such as Ratmagnet's Instagram and the subsequent outpouring of craft beer Me Too stories that has gone on to define the craft beer industry in 2021.
The U.S. began to kind of have this outpouring of stories of sexism and harassment and discrimination within the beer industry, particularly against women. And that all began when a brewer named Brienne Allen began kind of soliciting stories of sexism in beer, and it just became this massive Me Too watershed moment in U.S. beer that really rocked the craft beer industry. I mean, CEOs of major companies like Modern Times stepped away. So this was a significant event with some very real consequences. I mean, people lost jobs. So I did some reporting on that situation generally. And then women began contacting me through social media and email, saying, I have specific stories about working at Mikkeller San Diego. I have colleagues who also have stories to tell. Could we talk to you? And I think that was a combination of me having reported on the company before, but also having reported on this larger kind of MeToo moment. I had also done some reporting on allegations against the former founder of Dry and Bitter. So the women, I believe, saw that I could report this type of story fairly and professionally and thought I could be someone to talk to. So these women began sharing with me experiences of working at Mikkeller San Diego, as well as I was able to talk to some women who worked for other locations of the company, but mostly I focused on San Diego because that was where I had the most sources and it was US based. And they really described a toxic I think toxic gets thrown around a lot and isn't very specific. They were alleging an environment that not just allowed, but perpetuated bullying, harassment, in some cases, some really troubling workplace violations, safety violations, to the point that these women left the company. Many of them described really negative impacts on their mental health, that this really just working there took a massive toll on their lives. And while all of their stories were different and unique, they had some common themes to them and common experiences. And, through speaking to other sources on and off the record, I felt confident that these stories were true, were corroborated by others, and I felt I could go forward with these women's permission in reporting about these allegations.
Some of you may already be aware of Kate Bernot's reporting on the San Diego allegations, and some of you may simply not be. But either way, hearing directly from Megan Stone and Teresa Pominville really fills in the gaps around the allegations at San Diego and really speaks to the last sentiments that Kate Bernot shared with us just now. We will first hear from Megan Stone, who has a very long laundry list of issues she experienced while working for Mikkeller San Diego. Of course, I start out by asking how she came to work there.
I was pretty new in beer and really only had the view their perspective from a consumer, from having drank their beers and had never actually been to the tap room in San Diego or had much interaction with anybody who works there.
After a rather lax onboarding, work begins.
Being new in the beer industry, I was sort of is this how things are? I basically got 2 days of training and it was very choppy. So I would get thrown into one process that was already sort of started and then get pulled and go to another process before that one even finished. It was a bit overwhelming and felt a little unorganized, but I just tried to roll with it. And being a woman in beer, it's you're already heavily criticized and for abilities or knowledge. So I was just trying to keep my mouth shut and soak up as much as I could. Having been in the industry a bit longer, that's generally not the case when training at a new brewery. There were interviews that I had been in previously where I was asked if I could even lift things. This was at a brewery prior. And then eventually at Mikkeller, a lot of the men behind my back would criticize my strength or my abilities. And so I spent probably the first 2 years of my brewing career refusing help and refusing to ask anybody for anything because I felt like I had to work a lot harder to prove myself.
And when were these red flags clear to you at Mikkeller San Diego?
Within the first several weeks, I started to sort of notice the reality of my situation. I thought I was stepping into this really fun, hype brewery, and, bit by bit, things sort of started to come to light about how Mikkeller actually was cliquish to me. It felt like very toxic and juvenile. And when I say it was like a clique, we got separated into an AM and a PM shift. And any women and anybody who was newer or not a part of this initial clique was put on the PM shift, and we were called the cleanup crew. We were promised that we would switch shifts at some point, but that never happened ever. And our shift was 2 to 10 p.m. But Mikkeller, like, we ended up with so much work on our plates and such a long list of things. And again, like, I had a crew of like inexperienced people or new people that I had to train, while also being, for the majority of the time, the only person who knew how to brew or cellar on the shift. We ended up being there for like 10 to 12 hour shifts. And sometimes I would clock out early because we would get yelled at for how long we were there. And so I wasn't really sure how to handle that situation. I just didn't want to get yelled at anymore. There was zero HR until after I quit. Mikkeller was just a place where, honestly, we got like yelled at constantly for shit. There were a lot of safety issues there too, which were scary and very stressful. I mean, honestly, Mikkeller I refer to it as kind of like a fuck it brewery. There wasn't, until we had a lab person come along, there wasn't really much that was properly like recorded, especially in regards to yeast or anything like that. And there was one point when we brewed like a Cinco de Mayo beer, a Frida Kahlo beer, and there was mold inside the fermenter. And I remember them having a discussion like, oh, is this something like we have to dump, or, you know, what can we do about this? And there was someone who was like, no, technically, like, it's not going to hurt anybody, so we can just can it and sell it. So they'd stack grain bins, like with spent grain in them outside, like 6 high, which I wish I could like show you a picture of it, but it's like pretty high. And they'd stack like full kegs that high as well, and empty kegs even higher. Pallets of cans, like full cans, would be stacked to the ceiling of the cold box. There was a like leaking grain auger system for the mill, and there was flammable and explosive materials underneath of it, just like casually sitting there. The head brewer had taught me to like pull up the forklift and like with a pallet and like sit on the pallet to like mill grain in. And also specifically, we didn't have proper equipment to complete tasks. We were given hoses that weren't properly graded for heat or pressure. And when the staff would ask management for proper hoses, they would just be like, you don't need hoses, you have hoses, and just sort of force us to use the ones we already had. And then when those hoses burst, which I witnessed was like 180 degree water, they would just yell at us like it was our fault that we like broke these hoses. There was just a constant sort of like confusion because I was there for like 11 months, and I think we had 2 to 3 like GMs come through and 2 to 3 head brewers come through. And at one point there wasn't even a head brewer. Like the chain of command and like your bosses and all of that was also like a pretty confusing thing. But yeah, I mean, the initial head brewer that was there when I got there that I referenced earlier, he was extremely problematic. After he was fired, I had several employees come up to me and tell me, you know, he had told them things like he was going to fuck me straight. And I was told by a male coworker of mine, or several male coworkers, that he told everyone in regards to like my social media presence that he was going to milk that dyke for all she's worth. I mean, look at the bosses that I had. You know, I had a boss who told people he was going to fuck me straight, and who was like saying disgusting things about me and other women behind their back, and who would just like disappear and be stoned all the time. And then I had another boss who would scream at me in text messages. And then it was the GM when I left. I had expressed to him many times about the culture there and the bullying and harassment, and he yelled at everyone as a group once, and to my knowledge did nothing else. He's also the person who we had a employee holiday party once, and I brought my, at the time, wife, who is she's military, and she's been overseas. She has PTSD, and I had mentioned about how she had been an interrogator in the military, And literally the first words when he met her were asking her questions if she's ever waterboarded someone or about torturing people. So those were my bosses, and we had no HR, and this like huge disconnect from like Copenhagen and San Diego, at least from like my role. And so I had no idea like who to turn to. I mean, it goes to like not caring and safety issues and like improper training. Like this was like a brand new like person in beer and like inexperienced, kind of like threw her into it and didn't really give her much proper training. So I don't remember exactly how it happened or what happened, but yeah, no one was really set up for success there. I spoke up about it, but I never used their name, except to close friends and people I felt like I could trust, because I was scared. I mean, especially as a woman and a gay woman, you know, it's already hard enough to be in this industry. So I felt like I was going to be shunned and sort of exiled from the industry, and nobody was willing to have my back. So it was just like my word. Mikkeller could have just like flipped it and been like, well, she was just some like crazy woman or something, you know. I mean, not saying that's what they would have done, but for one woman to come forward and for no one to back her up, it just like doesn't really hold a lot of credibility in the beer world.
Have you been able to track your way back, and do you feel like you're in a better place since then? Are there certain lessons that you've taken from that experience that you have today?
I feel like, yeah, I mean, I feel like it's definitely an experience that taught me a lot about just how truly awful the beer industry can be. And that's not to say that like that's the entire industry, but I think it's a large majority of it, whether you're a worker or a consumer. But it kind of, I had a not so great experience with the next brewery after that, but nothing in comparison to Mikkeller. And but these experiences led me to sort of like reorganize my list of priorities. I no longer was trying to work for like the cool brewery, the exciting brewery. I did a lot more research on where I was ending up in regards to like the company culture and people who already worked there, and not just like asking men who worked there, but women or anybody else, you know, of like an underrepresented or marginalized group. And the number one priority for me at that point was company culture. So the quality of the beer was the bottom. And I mean, luckily at this point, I do work at a brewery now that kind of checks all the boxes for me. The beer is fantastic and the company culture is great. But Mikkeller sort of sparked, and the brewery after that and some of my other experiences, I just sort of got, I was angry. I was really, really angry for like a couple of years afterwards, and it affected my relationship and my life, just my anxiety and depression. And at one point I just got back into therapy and sort of worked on working through it and set it aside. But just sort of like hearing everyone's trauma now and sort of like feeling like I'm like reliving mine, is I'm angry again, but at least it's like kind of an anger that's motivating me to speak up more about it and to be a little more transparent about it and use names and my name. And I just don't want other people to have the same experience that I did. Yeah, there's like a tip that I give to women or underrepresented people is, you know, when making sure everything's written down in emails, and that's where you have your conversations so that everything's recorded. And if it's through a work email, to BCC yourself.
I just want to quickly touch on, from your perspective within the industry, you know, obviously these things don't end when you quit and walk out the door of a company like Mikkeller. So what is your perspective of things at the moment, and can you see change as a possibility in the future?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to touch on really quickly the fact that, like, you're absolutely right that it doesn't end like the day that I walk out the door. You know, you feel a little bit of relief, but it was really painful to watch so many people support this company and like be so excited about them and like post pictures with their beer and watch friends or like acquaintances spend their money there and support them, especially after some of them hearing my story and them thinking maybe I was just like this one person because people are so afraid to come forward and to name this place. But in regards to like the industry and where it's moving, I'm extremely hopeful that it's moving in a more inclusive and equitable direction. I think it's sort of absurd that it takes something so dramatic and like drastic and huge to push people to that. I think it should just be an everyday thing to respect people. I don't think, and treat people like, how they want to be treated, or treat everyone equally. I don't think that's such a crazy thing, but yeah, I think that there are some people who are genuine in their efforts, and that's great. And then I think that there's some people who are maybe a bit more performative, but I'm hopeful that the people who are genuine and who are true allies will continue to encourage other people in the industry to become those people as well. And hopefully it gets to a point where, there's more of the like supportive and like loud voices than there are the really terrible people.
We're now going to hear from Teresa, who worked in a bit of a different capacity than Megan. Here's her story.
I applied for assistant tasting room manager, which would be helping out the tasting room manager and also working some bar shifts. So I would still be making tips because I don't remember it paying very much. I think I started at like $14 an hour, which is not much.
Okay. So
yeah.
You're hired for the tasting room manager role. Take it from there. Tell us about what happened.
So after maybe 3 or 4 months of being the assistant tasting room manager, when I was like looking for other work because I wasn't making very much money, I was told like one morning, just like out of the blue, I think I was getting ready to go on vacation. And the new GM, not the first one I interviewed with, but totally different person, had pulled me aside first thing in the morning and was like, hey, we're firing this person today, and we want to offer you the tasting room manager position. So let me know. And that was pretty much it. And I think I went on vacation, but I accepted the job. I don't remember there being a formal offer letter or anything like that. And if there was, it's in my Mikkeller email, which they deleted immediately after I left. The title was retail manager, it became retail manager because I ended up, we had like a bottle club. So we did it's called the biking club. So it was kind of our like membership. I was managing that, planning all the events for that, staffing, finding all sorts of stuff. I was working with Keith on merchandise, so I was ordering all the merchandise and doing all the inventory for that. I was overseeing the web store, so we hired someone to manage or to do the web shipping and things like that. Obviously overseeing the tasting room, but I feel like that was like back burner of what I was doing because the bartenders there had it all figured out. They were great. I still had a lot of pride in my job. I think when I was having rough days, it was like, maybe I should just be happy that I have a job, even though I like hate it here and everyone seems to be miserable, whatever. I took pride in my job. I had a lot of fun. I can't say that I didn't enjoy myself at parts. I did have fun and we did a good job, and that was enough for me at the time.
You were getting a salary at that time.
Yeah. So when I first took the assistant job, I was just making hourly because I was making tips. But when I was promoted, I was given a salary. I was told it would be $42,500 a year. To me, I think sounded like what I was already making. So the fact that was, guaranteed every 2 weeks or whatever, I didn't even think twice about it. I just said, yeah. So then I was making salary. And I know it's hard to believe, but we didn't have benefits either. So, no health insurance. I know America is America. But it was one thing that I just couldn't quite wrap my head around because, as many outlets as Mikkeller has across the globe, this was their brick and mortar brewery. I just feel like if you're going to do it right, you've got all these full-time employees that are here and in California. Like, you chose to set up shop here, right? Like, couldn't wrap my head around that. I think I was on average clocking at least 50 to 60 hours a week. I think they were just like plugging, like I was still logging in and taking my time, whatever, my lunch times and things like that. But I think that they were just plugging in 80 hours every like pay period.
80 hours being for 2 weeks.
Correct. Yeah.
But you're
sometimes
working
it would be
120 or between 100 and 120.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah. Okay. It's not every week, but there were a lot of like 15, 16-hour days when there were events, and we had weekly beer releases. Sometimes there were multiple beer releases. So even if I was home, I was still communicating with the staff. Like, it was just like a nonstop thing. And then, at the end of the night, we have to send an email to Denmark with the inventory of everything every single day, every can, everything that we sold, the amount that we sold, the amount that we discounted, anything, like just anything. Like
anything everything. Related to the numbers you had to send to Denmark every single day. There is a few different versions of the story, but basically you're saying that Copenhagen were involved in the San Diego operations.
Yeah. Very, very involved. We saw them probably quarterly. They would come out and I don't know, we'd plan events around them being there. So I don't really know why they're saying that they weren't involved. Again, because I'm literally in contact with you every day, micromanaging the weirdest things.
We go on to discuss these emails a little further, and for the reasons that I can't name certain people, I can only confirm that Don and Peter were included in those daily emails. Our conversation carries on. Essentially, you're hired for one job, you begin doing another job, and then things escalate from there. Do you want to take us to the point where your job and your role expanded?
I think in like maybe February or March of 2018, they secured the building for the satellite tasting room in Little Italy, which I was so stoked for. I'd like gone and seen the site with them. Like, it was fun. And I was like, it was assumed that I would manage both, which I was fine with, right? I'd say this was like just before my 1 year. Like, I hadn't even been there a year at this point. But yeah, so they assumed I would manage both. However, at that point, I had realized that I wasn't making a legal salary in California. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, how did you find that out?
My husband's like a numbers guy. He's really good at math. I don't have to, but it was like, how am I working so much and I'm still broke? I don't have time for another job. Like, how is this a thing? And so he like looked, I think he just like calculated it. And it's just divided the number by, however many working hours in a year. And that's where you get the hourly. So like we figured out my hourly, and just did a quick Google search on what the minimum pay for exempt employees is. And it was under.
I can confirm that this was investigated, and based on the information that I had and what was available through the authorities in California, it was indeed an illegal wage at the time.
So I don't remember how I initially brought it up. I don't think I brought it up before the face-to-face meeting that I had called with the GM and the controller that I mentioned earlier. I think they knew it was coming because I'm taking on more roles. Like, I should be compensated for that. And they had come prepared to tell me that I hadn't shown them that I deserved a raise in their eyes. And to me, it didn't seem like a raise. It felt like an appropriate compensation.
Essentially, you went to them and you said, this is what I'm being paid. It's not appropriate. It's illegal. But I would also like to be compensated for the additional work I'm taking on.
Correct. Yeah.
Then they said to you,
I think they said that I could have like a week to do it or whatever, but I needed to prove to them. I think they actually said I needed to go above and beyond to prove to them that I needed a raise. Because they didn't see the justification in it at that moment. I did everything they asked me to do, and had been excited about taking on more. I enjoyed my work for the most part, and I was just tired of being taken advantage of, and that's what it felt like. So in that meeting, I think I said, well, consider this my 2 weeks. And then, which, my husband was fine. Like, it was fine, but we would usually like discuss this before I did anything like that. And I think how strongly I felt in that moment, I just did it. And then I, typed up my letter and sent it in, and it was, kind of awkward timing because I think I gave them a month's notice. That's because whatever, they don't have anyone else to do this stuff. And we actually had a trip planned. We were going to MBCC in Copenhagen. And so we had bought all the tickets and everything. Everything was already ready. And I'd given my notice. It's like, well, this is going to be weird. Nothing really comes from that. I just carried out my normal time. They paid me for that time. They paid me my vacation and everything. They gave me a final check. I went to Copenhagen, said, hey, what's up? It was fine. Like, there wasn't a lot of hard feelings. I think they were kind of bummed that I wasn't with the company anymore, but it didn't seem like they had nothing to talk. They didn't talk to me. Like, nobody spoke to me really directly about it. It was all just kind of superficial conversations that we were having. We spent a couple weeks in Europe, which was rad. I came back and went up to Oregon for my sister's graduation, and I was in the Portland airport and I got a call from Denmark on my cell phone.
This call was from Peter.
Like, never had a phone call. It's just him, kind of just super out of the blue. He's like, oh, how are you? Are you working yet? Like, I just wanted to call and tell you that we miss you. And I wanted to let you know that GM, we let him go. He kind of acknowledged that he was a cancer of the company. He believes that was the root of everyone's problems was Matt. So they got rid of him, and they wanted to invite me to apply for like the GM position, to take over his position. Like, I think at that point I had learned that the GM was easily making 6 figures. And so in my head, I'm like, all right, well, I'd come back for 6 figures. Like, I could do that. So I agreed to meet with him. And I think maybe a week later, he flew out to San Diego. I met him at a little hip restaurant in Little Italy, and we chatted and we drank wine and we ate, and it was fun. It was
She goes on to say that it was Peter and a gentleman that we're going to call Jeff for the sake of telling the story accurately.
Anyways, it was us 3, and it went really well. Like, we laughed the whole time. Like, it was a great, fine experience. And then I never heard back. So I followed up through an email.
This email was to Peter, and it also CC'd Jeff, the 2 people present at the meeting to discuss the GM role. And it wasn't Peter who replied. It was Jeff.
Replied that I was never being considered for GM, but if I wanted to come back for the same job that I had, the tasting room manager, retail manager, that I could do that.
It's at this point that I confirm exactly that it was indeed Jeff, the person who had been present at the dinner discussing the GM role, who had written this email.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, even though that's what the conversation was about. I wouldn't have come out and met you. I wouldn't have considered it if you said retail manager. Like, I wouldn't have come back for that. So I just dropped it. I just like, whatever. And then, I'm like looking for jobs and stuff. So I'm seeing what they're posting. And they had they hired 2 separate managers. So they had 1 manager for each location plus like assistants. And then they also promoted someone who was already working there to manage the Viking Club. Like, that was her full-time job. So, and they were paying what I asked for the first time, plus benefits. It wasn't something that I was super vocal about, but it's also something that I didn't think that I needed to be vocal about, because you're the one doing business here and you should be covering your own ass.
What strikes me from both of these testimonies is the fact that there seems to be this confusion around how involved, quote unquote, Copenhagen was with San Diego. Because it's one thing to hear 2 of these stories stand alone, 2 different things happening, but to understand that it's a part of the same pattern, essentially. And this is to consider that these are not the only sources from San Diego who were even in Kate Bernot's article. I was curious, did she have the question as well? How involved were Mikkeller with San Diego? It's a pretty big one because it's about responsibility and accountability and the fact that, yes, you can have standalone one-off episodes, but when these patterns keep repeating, there's some serious problems. And the question then becomes, did you not know? And therefore, are you neglectful in that sense? Or did you know and you didn't care? Here's Kate Bernot's thoughts on this.
Well, sure. So that was something I certainly was trying to figure out, is how involved was Copenhagen with what was going on in San Diego. And I found this extremely difficult for me to resolve tension that I was hearing from the women who had worked there, which was that human resources issues were totally ignored. Many of them said there was no HR structure. They didn't know who they were supposed to talk to. It was unclear who even reported to who and who was in charge of who. But yet, these same women also say that there was a lot of micromanaging from Copenhagen of other aspects of the business. One of the women who had worked at San Diego described having to every day send an email to Copenhagen about how much merchandise they were selling in their tap room, and they told her she couldn't print koozies with the brand on it. So on one hand, when there are these large issues, there's just silence and kind of a void of leadership. And yet Copenhagen is heavily involved in things like merchandise and beer sales and whether or not you can print koozies. So that made the women, I think, even more confused. It was like, well, you seem very concerned about certain aspects of the business, but not others. And one source described that, a couple of times a year, some executive from Copenhagen would fly over to San Diego and kind of walk around the brewery. And she said, tell everyone how lucky they were to work at Mikkeller, and then kind of jet off again.
And then, in the last weeks of this investigation, a new source came forward. We're going to call him John. Here's what John had to say that I found particularly interesting.
I saw things at San Diego that were horrible. I did things about it. I tried to get a lot of support from Denmark, and I feel that they didn't take it very seriously. I know for a fact
Don and Peter
both knew about the severity of these issues cut and dry in May, June of 2018 in San Diego.
John had an interesting trajectory in terms of his career pathway at Mikkeller. Of course, I wanted to first start with San Diego. It's my understanding that you began your employment at Mikkeller San Diego. Would you like to tell me a little bit more about the circumstances of that employment?
Well, first, I was originally hired by Mikkeller as the global director of supply chain. And I was meant to immediately go to Denmark, but I was told a couple of weeks before that was supposed to happen that they would like me to go to San Diego and help out. The visa process takes a little bit of time, and I was told that they were a little bit short-staffed. I wasn't given too many details. I did know that at the time, a couple of employees had left and a couple were terminated. I was never told at the time why for all of the employees or given much detail. I was told directly that the head brewer at the time was terminated for the reason of adjusting one of the recipes without really bringing that up to
Don.
So that was the reason I was given at the time. And so, when I got to Mikkeller San Diego, I was told to kind of act like a consultant, really. So kind of like investigate anything in the brewery that we can do to improve. And so I come from a supply chain operations background, working for craft beverage startups. And so I was anticipating finding a lot of issues that were very operational focused. And there were some issues with our, capital expansion plan, did not have enough glycol chilling capacity to run all the fermentation tanks and conditioning tanks, didn't have enough electrical capacity. Our warehousing operation was very insufficient, had to dump some product. And there's a lot of things that I was, turning over and finding.
John put this information in an email to Don and Peter. And in this next part, he's referring to Peter, who he gave the report to.
Gave him my report and kind of organized all the issues. Actually, the number one thing that I said was your biggest issue was workplace culture. And so, I'm a process-oriented guy. I'm, do operations and supply chain. When it comes to, managing employees, employee satisfaction, employee engagement, it's something that I've, been trained in as a manager, but not something that is kind of my bread and butter. So at the time, I came to this conclusion because I went to speak with every single individual at the company and kind of pick their brains about opportunities to improve, things we can do better. And I noticed that I wasn't getting a lot of information from the team of things we can do better. And some of the employees seemed a little bit scared or intimidated. So what I decided to do was create an anonymous employee engagement survey. It was either labeled employee engagement or employee satisfaction survey. I can't remember right now. And from that finding, that's when things started to really come out of, just a toxic workplace culture, people being harassed, people saying working at Mikkeller is a joke, really unhappy with the workplace, people feeling unsafe. And it just blew my mind. There's definitely a lot of variables that kind of came into play. There's a very high turnover of the general managers there. There was 3 general managers in a period of 14 months. So when you have that turnover, every single GM wants to do things a little bit differently. They have a different management style, different systems and processes, and just that instability is not a really good environment for, a positive working environment. Lack of senior level leadership. When I got there was the general manager and then the controller. And there was no mid-level, no managers, no directors after that, with about 25 employees total. Some of the responses that these individuals were giving was like, this is the company that I just joined, and was a pretty big red flag. But, I had the opportunity to kind of help solve this and help organize it and say, what are the next steps? What are we going to do to solve this? So I sent an email to
Don and Peter
with the employee engagement survey attached. And what I did was I copy and pasted maybe 3 or 4 of the most outrageous responses to some of the questions that I asked that were very, very shocking about, gender bullying, workplace harassment, people feeling unsafe working at Mikkeller, things in that regard. They were very concerning. At the time, we had a discussion about it internally, and it turns out the ultimate decision was to terminate the general manager at the time. There was not much else, kind of discussed other than let's get this guy out of there and get him replaced with somebody else. And I became the interim GM at Mikkeller San Diego. So that was about August 2018. So at the time, there's a few things that I did. We implemented a manager training that was focused around sexual harassment. This was through I think it was either the state of California or the city of San Diego that we got this survey through. I was given the authority to terminate people on the spot if I thought that was the right thing to do. So at the time when I was interim general manager at Mikkeller San Diego, I did terminate 5 employees, and 4 of them were from workplace harassment issues, and 2 of them were directly related to sexual harassment. So there was only 1 individual that I terminated that was performance-based during the time at Mikkeller San Diego. I really don't feel like this was something that was taken as a big concern. I really feel that, if I was
Gone
when I got that email and with those responses, the first thing I would do is really close my laptop and fly down to San Diego and try and figure out what's going on and solve the issue. And the entire time I was there for an entire year, he never once stepped foot in San Diego.
We're at a point now that, from my understanding, you recognize that there was an incredibly harmful workplace culture at San Diego, and you saw the impacts of that firsthand.
I do think there is a huge, huge lack of oversight from Mikkeller Denmark and Mikkeller San Diego, and just kind of, didn't put enough effort into running it effectively from an operational standpoint, from a capital expansion standpoint, and then putting people in the right place, and then having, proper management training protocol. None of that was really done, and it shows. And I also think there's a lack of concern when it comes to Mikkeller Denmark on the workplace side and workplace harassment, where it's not taken as seriously as it should have. And Mikkeller, it doesn't really do things the traditional way that they haven't, and that's been a testament to their success when it comes to marketing. They don't really have a marketing budget at all or a marketing team. You're never going to see a Mikkeller billboard advertising, their new IPA or things like that. They just don't do that, and they look at other breweries that do that and kind of put their nose in there a little bit. But when it comes to things like HR, it's the same thing. They traditionally don't have HR, and that's something that they think that they don't need. But at the end of the day, when it's one thing with marketing, it's another thing for HR when you don't have the proper structure in place to make sure that your employees are safe, really. And so, yeah, it's disheartening to think about.
The confirmation that John provides here on what he did when he first arrived at Mikkeller San Diego does conflict with some of the statements that the company has put out. But we're going to get to that later in this podcast. The San Diego story certainly doesn't end here. But for now, that's Mikkeller San Diego. Where we go now is headquarters. The next episode starts off with John's experiences there, from when he first arrived in Copenhagen. We stay at the Copenhagen headquarters for 2 episodes. And later in the podcast, we do revisit headquarters. But for now, I'll leave it here.
On the next episode of Super Cool Toxic Workplace.
So I knew that if I were to mention anything to her about my situation, he would, get wind of the conversation we had, and then I'd be terminated. So I kind of knew those were my only 2 options. So
approached me from behind in the middle of headquarters, slapped my rear, and whispered, "MeToo," in my ear. He proceeded to say that it was a good thing smartphones weren't around